You think holy war makes men noble? Watch what hunger does. In December 1098, the Syrian city of Ma'arat al-Numan fell to Crusaders trudging south from Antioch. Streets filled with corpses, granaries were empty, winter bit deep. Then came the line no writer liked to admit. They cooked human flesh. Not rumor, multiple chroniclers recorded it. Fulcher of Chartres described men slicing meat from dead enemies. Ralph of Caen repeated tales about children on spits. A letter to Pope Paschal II admitted eating putrid bodies in famine. This isn't legend. This is eyewitness shame. Let's plunge into the twisted truth today. You thought victory at Antioch meant the road to Jerusalem would be easy? Think again. The Crusader host staggered out of a half-year siege in 1098, with bellies swollen by illness, not food, and with supply lines hacked to ribbons. When they turned on Ma'arat al-Numan that autumn, they brought something worse than steel, thousands of empty mouths. Imagine the sound entering that valley. Boots rasping, carts groaning, coughing in the cold, chaplains promising salvation to men who could barely stand. The city's walls would be assaulted. Its stores, if any, would be inhaled. Hunger rode in front like a herald. It sinks into bones, rewires the brain, makes a soldier's rosary beads feel like meals and a shield look like a platter. They cut brush for fires, they boiled weeds, they swallowed pride. And every hour, winter bit deeper. This wasn't a glorious march, it was a procession of need. The line between discipline and desperation thinned, and then, like a bowstring in frost, it snapped. If you think faith alone keeps order, wait until faith collides with famine. That's not a prayer, you're about to see the experiment. But even a starving army can take a city. And that's exactly what happened next. Fast, bloody, and unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. The siege hit in late November. After days of pressure, siege engines, and mining, Crusaders broke Ma'arat's defenses around December 11 to 12, 1098. Fighting paused at night, then resumed in a morning of plunder and killing. Some defenders tried to negotiate surrender. Many civilians died. Women and children were enslaved. Two titans, Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond of Saint-Gilles, then snarled over who owned the city and its spoils. That argument mattered because while they wrangled, thousands of foot soldiers waited inside a town that wasn't feeding them. The month dragged. The granaries didn't, and the weather did not care who wore a cross. By mid-December, the city had become a trap of hunger and corpses, and the worst decisions in medieval memory began to feel like options. The dates are clear, and so is the fallout. The Crusaders took Ma'arat in December 1098 and did not march south again until January 13, 1099, long enough for food to vanish and for taboos to begin dissolving in the pot. How do we know? Because nearly a dozen Latin chronicles, and even a brief Arab note, say so. None of them deny that something unthinkable happened at Ma'arat. They only argue about when and why. That debate is where the horror sharpens. Before we touch the grisly eyewitness lines, listen to the official voice. In 1099, after Jerusalem fell, a letter went out from the Crusader leadership in the east, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Archbishop d'Ambert, reporting victories and horrors to Pope Paschal II. Buried in the pious prose is a sentence that should make your blood freeze. During Ma'arat, famine grew so desperate that Christians ate the putrid bodies of Saracens. That's not an enemy slur. That's not a tavern rumor. That's the Crusaders' own leadership, writing to the Pope admitting cannibalism happened under their banner. Think about the psychology. These were men desperate to frame the whole expedition as sacred history, the story of a new Israel. And they still put the unthinkable on paper. Why? Because silence would be a lie too big for the church to swallow when whispers were already sprinting through Europe. That letter is the hinge where piety meets biology, and biology wins. If you want to know how bad it was in that winter month trapped inside Ma'arat, the leaders told you themselves. You can almost hear the stink of the pits and the prayers over cooking fires. Confession, not propaganda, preserved this atrocity. One camp of sources is almost careful, almost embarrassed. The anonymous Gesta Francorum, close to events, often blunt, claims cannibalism came after the siege, as secret survival, not spectacle. The image is clinical. Men cutting flesh from dead bodies into strips and cooking it to eat. No glory, no bravado, just hunger trimming human taboo like leather. Other chroniclers who reworked the Gesta followed suit. Peter Tudebode echoes the story, even emphasizing that only Muslims were eaten, an ugly attempt at a moral firewall. Eat the enemy's corpses, not your own dead. As if lines like that hold when soup is boiling. This after the siege hunger made us do it version reads like a plea. Forgive us, circumstances forced our hands. You can feel the shame shaping the narrative, steering it away from theater, insisting it happened in the shadows. Yet even that plea admits the central fact. Human flesh was cooked and consumed. The modern brain gropes for a label. Survival cannibalism, the kind etched in snow disasters or shipwrecks. But here it rotted in the rubble of a conquered city, while men with crosses on their chests argued about land. If this were the only version, maybe the Crusades' conscience could limp away. It wasn't. Then there is Fulcher of Chartres, not at Mayorat but relying on men who were an observant cleric who served kings and chronicled the expedition for decades. He doesn't hide behind euphemism. He shudders as he writes that many, maddened by hunger, cut chunks from the buttocks of dead Saracens, roasted them hastily, and savagely filled their mouths. You can feel him recoil on the page, a man aghast at believers eating forbidden food and taboo flesh, yet forced to put the words down because everyone had heard. This is not an enemy caricature. It is a churchman's wounded memory, and Fulcher situates it while the siege still strained the city, a detail that matters. Cannibalism in secret after victory is ghastly. Cannibalism during the siege in view of the living enemy is a weapon. It says, "We are beyond fear, beyond law, beyond the human script you know." Fulcher's line reads like a whispered confession from the campfires, the kind that makes a priest stare into smoke for hours. If you ever thought medieval chronicles were just propaganda, meet the sentence that hurts its own author to write. It survived because it scandalized even the faithful. Ralph of Caen went further, writing the Gesta Tancredi, drawing on interviews with fighters from the Norman contingents. He records adults in the stew pot, children on spits, a scene staged by hunger but presented like theater. He even says he heard this from the perpetrators themselves. Ab ipsis flagitia auctoribus. That's not a camp rumor. That's confession as boast. And it's horrifying because it collides with medieval rhetoric. Children on spits reads like biblical reverse sacrifice, a violence designed to unmake an enemy's world. Historians argue about timing, before surrender, to break morale, or after, when corpses lay everywhere. But Ralph's tone is the twist. He relays atrocity with a grim relish he shares with his informants. Is this overstatement? Maybe. Yet his lines match the larger pattern. Multiple sources, different details, the same taboo. If anything, the variance smells of embarrassment and self-defense, some trying to hide, some trying to terrify. And for modern ears, a sick thought. Did starving men realize that the more outrageous the rumor, the faster defenders would give up? Whether intended or not, that's exactly how terror works. Outrage moves quicker than grain. At Ma'arat, the menu turned into a message. Another voice, likely present in person, is Raymond of Aguilera, a chaplain in the southern French host. He admits cannibalism after the city fell, in the midst of famine, but adds a chilling phrase. It happened openly and with gusto, as if secrecy had snapped. He describes scenes meant to shock, consumption not hidden in alleys, but performed in public to startle the outsiders, the Muslim onlookers, and any who still considered resisting. There's a contradiction here. If the city had already fallen, and most Muslims were dead or enslaved, who was there to frighten? Maybe neighboring garrisons, maybe rebellious quarters, maybe simply each other. Terror turned inward, a dare among the starving to prove nothing could stop them. That contradiction is precisely why these accounts are so valuable. No single chronicle could tame Ma'arat. They wrestle in real time with something that broke the rules of holy war. Today we file it under war crime. In 1098 they inventoried it under miracles gone dark and hunger's tyranny. If you expected smooth apologetics, you get a bruised chorus instead. And all those bruises map the event. What happens after a shame nobody can scrub clean? You look for a scapegoat. Enter the Tafurs, the ragged, near-barefoot poor who followed the Crusader armies, sometimes fighting, often scavenging. Later writers painted them as cannibal fanatics, roasting Saracen bodies at Antioch and Ma'arat, as if the hunger belonged to the lowest ranks alone. It's tidy, classist, and wrong. The earliest accounts don't pin Ma'arat's horror on a single underclass. The Tafur legend swells in later songs and chronicles, precisely when the nobility needed distance from the indecent memory. Modern historians have torn that veil. J. Rubenstein calls the Tafur blame a convenient scapegoat kept alive by writers eager to corral a general stain into the bodies of the poor. In short, the cannibal was not a costume worn by beggars. It was a moment of collapse that cut across the host. If you hear the phrase King Tafur swaggering through a verse, recognize it as literature working damage control. Poverty turned into a villain so armored men could walk away cleaner. Historical reality, like hunger, is less selective. Was it only starvation? Or was cannibalism, in some mouths, also a tactic? Some medieval storytellers, like Guibert of Nogent and William of Tyre, reframed Ma'arat as deliberate psychological warfare. Eat the enemy to unmake his courage. Fulcher's placement of the act during siege, not after, points in that direction. So does the tonal swagger in Ralph's report. And modern analysis threads the needle. Hunger drove men to the pot, but others saw the spectacle's value and made sure news of it traveled. Terror is a logistics system. It moves faster than carts and frightens farther than arrows. Reports of Ma'arat's frenzy preceded the Crusaders south. Towns took truce. Garrisons watched gates open. Thomas Asbridge notes that these atrocities, paradoxically, sometimes smoothed the road to Jerusalem by convincing opponents the Franks were invincible savages. That is not an excuse. It is a grim accounting. Men whose bodies were failing learned that rumor could carry as much weight as siege engines. In the ledger of medieval war, fear is always listed under foraging. At Ma'arat, they foraged on the dead, and the story fed the next march. Here's an uncomfortable twist. For all the noise in Latin sources, medieval Arab chroniclers barely linger on the cannibalism itself. One source mentions it as hunger, racked by dearth, and moves on. Later modern narratives sometimes treat the episode as a foundational trauma in Arab memory, but careful scholarship pushes back. The gory details are overwhelmingly preserved by Christian writers, each wrestling with their own shame or spin. That doesn't mean the massacre at Ma'arat wasn't remembered. It was. It means the cannibal part lived mostly in Crusader pens, not in a sustained Arabic chorus. Why would that be? Perhaps because enemies killing civilians felt like the main wound, and cannibalism, whether whispered or staged, was a fringe horror in a wider catastrophe. Or perhaps because Muslim writers assumed famine could drive any army mad and focused on politics, not kitchens. Either way, the strange imbalance matters. It tells you the Crusaders were not slandering foes. They were indicting themselves. And the self-indictment kept mutating. Apology, threat, scapegoat, sermon. Memory is not neutral. At Ma'arat, it belonged, uncomfortably, to the men who broke the taboo. How do you square this with faith? Medieval preaching sold the crusade as penance on horseback. Yet at Ma'arat, the body vetoed the sermon. Chroniclers try to patch the tear. Some stress necessity, hoping God grades on a curve when the pot is empty. Others imply providence. If God permitted it, maybe he meant it to terrify unbelievers into surrender. You can feel the rhetorical panic. Later writers talk about eating sins, or make hunger itself a scourge sent by heaven that absolves the starving of the worst trespass. Modern scholars trace how different texts massage the horror. Baldric turning famine into punishment enough, Fulcher admitting what piety cannot cover, and longer studies tracking how food and miracle talk swirl around the shame. But the blunt truth bleeds through every varnish. When you're starving, you stop being a symbol and become an animal with prayers. That's not medieval. That's human. At Ma'arat, the cross on the tunic didn't change the stomach's language. It only made the confession more explosive. The chroniclers knew that, which is why their ink trembles. Pull back from the smoke and hear the quieter cause. Logistics. Antioch had bled the army. Winter closed the Syrian countryside like a fist. Ma'arat's stores proved thinner than rumor promised. And while leaders quarreled over rights and titles, thousands lingered without resupply. Modern studies of First Crusade logistics point out the obvious thing no miracle can fix. An army marches on its stomach, and it starves on its pride. The longer Raymond and Bohemond argued, the more the rank and file sharpened their knives on whatever looked edible: leather, roots, dogs, and then the dead. That does not minimize guilt. It identifies the fuse. Siege warfare isn't just ladders and towers. It is math. The ledger at Ma'arat reads like a slow-burn tragedy. Too many men, too little grain, too much delay, too cold a sky. The horror that followed was not inevitable, but it was rehearsed by every empty cart. When people call the crusade epic, remember this chapter is logistics turned into sin. And in the accounts that survive, you can hear that fact scraping under every sentence. If there's a single set of details you wish you could unknow, it's these. Albert of Aachen says Christians, amid scarcity, ate both killed Muslims and dogs. Fulcher pictures men hacking flesh from buttocks. Another pen describes bodies traded like meat. These are not metaphors, they're inventory. Once that line is crossed, every corner of the city becomes a butcher's lane. And yet the same pages also record prayer, processions, relics, men begging God while doing what God's law forbids. That's not contradiction, that's collapse. Hunger does not ask for a theological footnote. It simply seizes the hand. And from there, the rumor gallops. When the Crusaders finally left Ma'arat in mid-January 1099, they carried more than loot. They carried a reputation. South along the coast, garrisons did the math: resist the cannibals or negotiate. Some chose truces. Fear bought time that grain could not. And Ma'arat became the wound the Crusader memory could never cauterize: recorded, denied, justified, and above all, remembered. Here's the final twist before we close the city gates. However you parse the dates, during the siege as spectacle, after it as survival, the story of Ma'arat outran the army. Asbridge notes that news of their bloodthirsty barbarity often pushed rulers into humiliating truces rather than open battle, buying the starving Crusaders the one resource they actually needed: time. Terror became a supply train. It is obscene, but it worked. Meanwhile, inside the Latin memory, writers kept trying to domesticate the incident, blame the poor, call it rumor, call it penance, call it strategy. Nothing stuck. Because under all the spin was a simple line men kept copying, sometimes with a shudder, sometimes with a smirk. At Ma'arat al-Numan, we ate the dead. That sentence doesn't serve anyone's propaganda for long. It sticks in the throat. It should. Hold it there a moment, like a taste that will not wash away, and then ask the only honest question left. What happens to a holy war when it eats its own idea of holiness to live another day? From the first line of shame to the last rumor of terror, you've watched a moral order come apart in real time. At Ma'arat al-Numan, December 1098, an army born in sermons and crowned by a miracle at Antioch walked into a winter city and came out with a story it could never bury. The sources don't agree on the staging. Some hide it behind hunger after the walls fell. Others shove it into the siege itself, in the line of sight, like theater. But they agree on the core. Human flesh was cooked and eaten, and the men who did it wore crosses on their chests. That unanimity matters more than any apologetic varnish. It tells you the taboo was broken so loudly that silence wasn't an option. Look back over the voices. The anonymous Gesta trying to shrink the scene to survival, as if secrecy could protect a soul. Fulcher of Chartres, a churchman, writing the word buttocks with a tremor you can feel 8 centuries later. Ralph of Cannes opening the curtain on adults in the pot, children on spits, either reporting bravado or complicit in amplifying it. Raymond of Aguilar's admitting it happened in public with gusto, while his own chronology strains to explain who the audience could have been. And behind them all, the leadership's letter, the thing popes save, confessing the putrid bodies line with the kind of reluctant clarity that governments only use when they know the rumor will get home first. That is the chorus. No single voice could carry the tune. Together, they sing a theme you can't unhear. So what do we do with it? First, resist the comforting lies. It was all propaganda. It wasn't. The propaganda theory collapses under the multiplicity of Christian witnesses, some too pious and too close to the events to invent a sin that stains them. It was only the ragged poor, the Tafurs. That's a handoff, not a history. Later writers threw the filth downhill to protect knighthood, but the earliest accounts don't isolate a class of cannibals. Hunger is not picky, and neither is guilt. It was justified. No. You can say it was human. You can say it was desperate. You can even say some realized the spectacle might frighten garrisons into truces. But the moment you turn it into righteousness, the sources you're relying on recoil from you. They recorded a taboo. They didn't bless it. Second, learn the cold arithmetic. Logistics, not legend, set the table. Antioch emptied the cupboard. Winter locked the door. A bickering elite held the army in a place that could not feed it. The longer they argued, the more likely it became that men would boil leather, eat dogs, and then cross the last line. When you read medieval history, don't float above the ground in a cloud of banners. Count the carts, measure the weather, ask who was eating what in week 4. The truth will follow the rations. Third, face the modern mirror. We like to believe the Geneva Conventions are a firewall against hell. They're a promise built on lessons like Mayorat. Put enough civilians and soldiers in a sealed space without food, and law phrase. Call it Leningrad or a shipwreck in the South Seas, or a mountain crash. Human bodies revert under pressure. In the First Crusade, the pressure cooked inside a theology that promised absolution for violence. At Mayorat, that theology met the stomach and lost. The chronicler's embarrassment is the tell. They needed this war to look like a pilgrimage. And yet, when the quills moved, the worst sentence insisted on being written. We ate the dead. The crusade never fully recovered its moral shine from that line. And maybe that's right. Grand stories deserve their stains. Finally, hold the tension, because that's where the lesson lives. Mayorat is not only a horror story, it's also a warning label. Beware of sacred causes that promise to lift men above their appetites. Those promises snap the loudest when hunger arrives. Beware of leaders who argue over trophies while their followers starve. Those arguments are paid for in flesh. Beware of tales that shove guilt into the mouths of the poor. Those tales are usually written by the full. And beware of our own appetite for outrage, because fear is a supply chain. It buys victories none of us should be proud of. Thomas Asbridge's unsettling point remains. Sometimes atrocities smoothed the road. If you're tempted to file that under effective, remember what else it files under. So the takeaway is not pious despair. It's practical humility. Privacy and choice, what you eat, who you fight, how long you hold a town, are modern luxuries bought at a price. We guard them with paperwork because we've seen what happens without it. The line at Mayorat is a flare in the dark. Faith doesn't cancel biology, and biology does not apologize. The Chronicles couldn't ignore that. Neither should we. Now a question to haunt you. In our present, what custom do we excuse? What spectacle do we tolerate? That future generations will whisper about the way we whisper Mayorat. Food for thought, of the kind that should never be cooked. Comment the part that shocked you the most. Subscribe for more brutally honest history. Like if you're glad you weren't born in the Dark Ages.